This is the adaptive cycle. The adaptive cycle is a model of ecological succession. It really just describes how ecosystems evolve. And you can see that it's in 4 phases. So phase 1 is exploitation to conservation, release, and reorganization. That first phase between exploitation and conservation describes how ecosystems emerge. So if you have a barren land, what's going to happen is you're going to have things called R species come in. They're like pioneer species or these entrepreneurial species that they come in and they rapidly adapt and kind of prototype different ideas. They usually have lots of seeds, they have really shallow roots, and they're providing a really important service to that area in that in the way that they live and die so quickly, they're providing the biomass for other species to start to grow. And you go into a state of conservation with these larger, slower moving K species. This is that front loop I'm talking about, and you can see that as the sun is hitting the earth, these species will start to take that high quality energy and dissipate that. They'll turn the sunlight into sugars and through the living and dying start to create that biomass for these larger, slower species to emerge. But what's really interesting is that as you go into a state of conservation, these systems actually become a lot more rigid. And that means that they can't change. And why that's important is because the environment around it is going to be changing. The weather changes, the climate changes, and yet it's very difficult for these K species to make adaptations. And what happens is when you're stuck in that conservation phase, when all of the nutrients and the resources are stuck, for example, in the trunks of trees, it's really hard to access those resources. So what happens naturally is you go into this back loop of release and reorganization. And release can be at multiple scales. At a systems level, it could be like a forest fire or a pest invading an entire ecosystem. Or it could just be a tree falling over. But what's important about this back phase is that the release allows the nutrients, all those stored resources to go back into the system. And it allows new species to come in and kind of exploit those new free resources. And it allows the system to reorganize and then go back through this second loop. What happens in this reorganization phase is that the species that emerge and survive will be more attuned to the conditions that they're in. So give you an example. Say a tree, like a willow tree, is along a stream. And if that stream dries up, it's in a state of conservation, and eventually the willow will die and release back into the system. And what happens is the organisms that come and reorganize might be more drought resistant if that river's dried up. They'll be more appropriate and more attuned to those local conditions. What's so interesting about this model is that it gives us kind of a framework for how to look at our systems, our built environment. And you can actually transpose that model and look at the systems that we've kind of inherited or developed. So an example is the automobile industry. Early on, people making automobiles were kind of garage hackers. They were in there just making stuff, trying to figure it out, very entrepreneurial, pioneer species. And they come up with a design. And from that, they've kind of hit this market and everyone's interested. They grow into a state of conservation where all of a sudden now you've got new competition, you've got higher diversity of within the industry, you've got like a battling kind of like a complex ecosystem. But what's really interesting is that in 2008, what we saw is when the market was starting to get volatile and trying to collapse, it was trying to show us this release phase. It was trying to go into a natural release and reorganization, especially in the automotive industry, where we had 3 major players in Detroit. And what we did as a species, instead of allowing that release and reorganization, is we pumped a lot of money into conserving those systems. And from a human sense, that makes a lot of sense because those are a lot of people, that's a lot of livelihoods that are at stake, so we want to try and conserve all those jobs. But what could have been done is that maybe that money could have been distributed to all the innovation, like different transportation systems or different ways of creating cars. And you maybe would have seen a natural evolution. But we've been able to hold system in conservation. What's also interesting is that naturally the system got disrupted anyways, and it will probably get disrupted just from innovation and entrepreneurs. The best example is Tesla, and specifically Elon Musk. The way that he took this state of conservation, he released our traditional way of thinking how to propel automobiles, moving away from the combustion engine, and he made a fully electric car that you can see now is reorganizing the entire system. And we're seeing a lot of these cars, or a lot of these companies, try to catch up and release and reorganize and make a fully electric car like Tesla. What's also interesting is that we as humans have the ability to use our thoughts to inform our designs. So we take assumptions for how the world works and we embed those into our designs. This is a picture of Shanghai it'd be about 29 years ago. And you can see that it's relatively flat. In this state, there's more availability for entrepreneurship. People can do more things, whether it's like making different transportation systems or how they use their environment. And through all of that innovation and entrepreneurship, they created the foundation, whether it be an economic foundation or just a psychological foundation for how that system emerges. So this is Shanghai today. And you can see that very much like an ecosystem, it's grown from these R species to massive K species. And these big industries, these big towers, this big infrastructure is much more difficult to adapt. And so what we do is we keep it in a state of conservation. We put a lot of energy into maintaining these systems. I'll give you an example. In most cities, we use underground buried water infrastructure. So we move our waste and we move our water through underground pipes. And as the city grows and as more people depend on those systems, it becomes very hard to let them just fail. And what we see in a lot of cities is that they're naturally failing anyways because they're not maintained well enough. So we have to put a lot of energy and money and materials into keeping these systems in a state of conservation. So what we can learn from this is that, well, one, we're different than the rest of the natural world because we can conserve systems unnaturally. We can put energy into these things and keep them static. And we're also tied to emotional kind of responses. We don't want systems to fail, whether it's because we're attached to them psychologically or physically, or our jobs are related to them. That state of conservation is really important, and it showcases how much humans really fear that release stage, especially when the system is so large and so complex. Ecosystems naturally go towards higher diversity and more complexity. And in that state of complexity, ecosystems actually allow release to happen. It's a very natural thing for release to take place, but they do it at smaller scales. And you could think of a tree, for example. A tree is this big system and it's kind of in a state of conservation, but every fall, that tree will drop its leaves. It will release the leaves and allow those leaves to go back into the soil and allow new leaves to kind of start up again. And those new leaves will be more attuned to the conditions, whether they're broader to pick up more sunlight, they're smaller to stop so much water being evaporated from them. But that release allows the system to adapt and evolve. And another example is like maybe a tree falls in a forest. That's a bigger release. But at an ecosystem level, that tree falling allows new species to use those resources and fill up that gap. And that allows more diversity and more redundancy and ultimately more resilience. So you can see that in an ecosystem, we have multiple adaptive cycles, which are called a panarchy. And because there's failure at smaller scales, the system can keep maintaining its resilience. It's constantly taking feedback from the environment. Another example is even at the bark level. So you think of a trunk of a tree, that bark is picking up information from the environment. It's learning, okay, how much oxygen do I have? Are there pests here? Are there invaders? And making autonomous adaptations. It's changing without really talking to the rest of the tree and saying, okay, there's a lot of people hitting me, or there's an axe that keeps pumping me. I'm gonna make some changes. I hope you guys are okay with it. And it'll adapt and evolve at a smaller scale. When you compare that to human systems, a lot of our bureaucracy or a lot of top-down management stops this small-scale release from happening. So you can see that we kind of collapse this into this, and then this into this system. And that makes us very vulnerable because release at this level is way more dramatic than release at this level. So that's the adaptive cycle. It's a quick introduction to how ecosystems evolve and how that model could really inform how we look at a built system or our buildings in our built environment. All right, thank you so much for joining me. If you're interested in learning more ways that nature could inform our designs, check out an idea called biomimicry. It's innovation that's inspired by nature. For example, Velcro, which was inspired by burrs. It's a way of looking at the world that really revolutionizes how we see both nature and design, and it's leading to a whole new slew of innovations that are changing the way that we do things. You can check out biomimicryfrontiers.com to learn more about biomimicry, or if you're interested in actually taking a course on biomimicry, we are offering an online do-it-yourself course that really takes everything that I've learned from the last 15 years of teaching and practicing biomimicry, and I'm giving it to you, helping inspire more technologies that are inspired by nature and that could really prove to creating a sustainable and efficient way of doing things.